The mud of Denton, Colorado had a particular character in the spring of 1885. It was not the simple, honest mud of a prairie rainstorm, but a thick, greedy clay churned by the hooves of freight horses and the wheels of buckboards, seasoned with coal dust from the station and the faint, sour smell of last winter's sorrows. On a Friday, this mud was at its worst, as the whole county seemed to converge on the small platform to greet the westbound train from Denver. From her small floral stall, wedged between the ticket office and the baggage claim, Nora Wells watched the churn. She had watched it every day for 6 years, ever since she had arrived with little more than a widow's pension and a stubborn knowledge of what makes roots take hold. Her stall was an island of improbable color in the sea of brown and gray. There were buckets of Indian paintbrush, wild columbine, and the sturdy, cheerful faces of daisies. The air inside smelled of damp earth and green stems, a clean scent that fought a losing battle against the coal smoke, but never surrendered. Nora knew the days of the week, not by a calendar but by the rhythm of the station. Monday was freight. Wednesday was mail. But Friday was Jesse Calhoun. For 4 years, he had been as predictable as the 3:15 train itself. He would ride in from his ranch out in the high meadow country, his horse a fine-boned roan that looked as tired of this ritual as its owner. He would tie the horse to the hitching post, his movements economical and sure, the way of a man who worked with his hands and his back from sunup to sundown. He was 25, but the sun and a quiet weight in his posture made him seem older. He was a solid man. That was the word that always came to Nora's mind. Solid, like a well-set fence post or the granite face of the mountains that loomed to the west. His approach was always the same. He would walk not to the platform bench, but to her window first. He would remove his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-cured wheat, and nod. His eyes were a pale, clear blue, and they always held the same expression of strained hope. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wells," he would say. His voice was a low baritone, dusty from disuse. "Mr. Calhoun," she would reply, her hands already moving. She did not need to ask what he wanted. It was always the same. A small, tight bouquet of cornflowers and daisies. Not a courting bouquet, full and ostentatious. It was a waiting bouquet. A small, persistent flame of a thing. She would wrap the stems in a damp cloth and then in brown paper, and he would hand her the coins, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, impersonal moment. "For the train," he would say, though it was a statement, not a question. "For the train," she would confirm. Then he would take the flowers and walk to the long bench at the far end of the platform, the one with the clearest view of the tracks as they curved out of sight. He would sit, place the bouquet beside him on the weathered wood, and wait. He never read a paper. He never spoke to anyone. He just watched the tracks. The train would arrive in a great shuddering sigh of steam and steel. People would spill out, a chaotic jumble of greetings and reunions. Jesse would stand, his gaze sweeping over every woman who stepped down from the passenger cars. He would scan each face, his shoulders held in a posture of rigid expectation. Nora would watch him from her window, her fingers paused in the act of trimming a rose thorn or tying a ribbon. She saw the hope drain from him, millimeter by millimeter, as the crowd thinned and the last passenger alighted. He would stand there for a long moment after the conductor called the all clear and the train began to pull away, a solitary figure holding a small, foolish bouquet. Then he would turn, walk back to his horse, mount up, and ride away, the flowers still in his hand. He never looked back. Nora knew the story. The whole of Denton knew the story, in the way small towns know such things pieced together from whispers and observations. Clara Marsh, the banker's pretty daughter, had left for Denver 4 years ago. She had promised Jesse Calhoun she would come back. She was 21 then, full of life and dreams too big for Denton. Jesse, who had loved her since they were children, had believed her. And so he waited. At first, the town had seen it as romantic. a testament to loyalty. But as the months turned into years, the romance curdled into something else. Pity, a quiet sadness. He was becoming one of Denton's fixtures, a landmark of heartache. The man who waited. And Nora Wells was the woman who sold him the props for his weekly play. 208 bouquets. She had counted once, on a slow winter afternoon. 208 Fridays of watching that quiet hope wither on the vine. This Friday was different. The sky, which had been threatening all morning, finally broke. The rain came not in a gentle spring shower, but in a cold, driving sheet that turned the station platform into a slick mirror and the street into a river of that thick, greedy mud. Most of the usual crowd had stayed home. The platform was nearly deserted, save for the station master, Mr. Harris, huddled in his office, and Jesse Calhoun sitting on his bench. He had his coat collar turned up, the brim of his hat angled against the downpour. The little bouquet sat beside him, its paper wrapping growing dark and soft with the rain. Nora watched him from the dry shelter of her stall. The damp chill seemed to seep through the glass, settling in her own bones. It was a miserable day for hope. The train was late. When it finally arrived, it seemed a weary, defeated beast, shrouded in a cloak of steam and rain. Only 3 people got off. A salesman in a damp bowler hat, and an elderly couple Nora recognized from Crestfall. No Clara Marsh. Of course, no Clara Marsh. Jesse did not even stand this time. He just watched them disembark, his posture slumping as the last door closed. The train hissed, groaned, and began its slow departure, its mournful whistle swallowed by the sound of the rain. Jesse remained on the bench, a statue of disappointment. The water dripped from the brim of his hat onto the flowers, each drop a tiny, percussive tick against the silence. He sat there for a full 5 minutes after the train was gone, its red lantern vanishing into the gray curtain of the storm. Then he stood, slowly, like an old man. He picked up the waterlogged bouquet and began to walk, not toward his horse, but toward the relative dryness of the station's overhang. He stopped in front of her stall, more to escape the rain than for any other reason. He stood there, dripping onto the wooden boards. He did not look at her, just stared out at the deluge. The silence between them was different today. It was not the comfortable silence of a transaction, but something heavier, filled with the weight of 4 years of unspoken futility. Nora found herself wiping down a perfectly clean countertop with a cloth. Her hands needed something to do. She could feel his stillness, his dejection. It was a tangible thing, like the cold air. 208 times she had watched this. 208 times she had said nothing. She stopped wiping. She looked at his reflection in the clean glass of her window. A man drenched in rain and memory. The words came out before she could stop them, quiet but clear enough to cut through the drumming of the storm. Is she coming back? Jesse Calhoun went rigid. It was not a dramatic movement, just a stiffening of his shoulders, a slight tilt of his head. He did not turn to look at her. He continued to stare out at the rain, but his focus was no longer on the weather. It was on the question that hung in the air between them, fragile and terrible. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. It was too forward. It was not her place. He was a customer, a man nursing a private grief. She had crossed a line. She expected him to turn on his heel and leave, to never come back. She braced herself for the cold dismissal his silence promised. He did not leave. A full minute passed. The only sound was the rain on the tin roof of the station. Finally, he shifted his weight, turning just enough to acknowledge her presence without fully facing her. "Weather's bad for the new lambs," he said. The deflection was so complete, so utterly unexpected, that Nora could only blink. He had not answered her question. He had simply built a wall of conversation around it, brick by mundane brick. She found her own voice, following his lead. "It is," she agreed. Mr. Harris says the creek is already rising. It will, Jesse said. He finally looked at her, his blue eyes tired but not unkind. Ranch is high enough. It's the low pastures I worry for. You have help? She asked, her voice steady now. He gave a short, humorless shake of his head. Just me. They stood there for another 10 minutes, talking about the rain and the price of feed and the rot that was threatening the timbers of the station platform. It was the longest conversation they had ever had. It was the first conversation they had ever had. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, but he spoke. He answered her questions about his land, about the work. He even asked one of his own. These flowers, he gestured vaguely at a bucket of purple lupines. They grow wild up my way. They like the high country, Nora said. They're stubborn. He almost smiled. It was a flicker of something at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. Stubborn is right. When the rain finally eased to a persistent drizzle, he seemed to remember himself. He straightened up, the spell broken. He looked at the bouquet in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. The paper was ruined, the petals bruised by the downpour. Well, he said, nodding to her. Afternoon, Mrs. Wells. He turned and walked to his horse, the ruined flowers still clutched in his fist. Nora watched him ride away, his back straight against the gray sky. He had not answered her question, but he had stayed. The next Friday was bright and clear, the world washed clean. Jesse Calhoun arrived at his usual time. He came to her window, hat in hand. Afternoon, Mrs. Wells, he said. Mr. Calhoun, she replied. She had the little bouquet of cornflowers and daisies ready. He paid, took the flowers, and went to his bench. The train came. The train left. Clara Marsh was not on it. He stood for his customary moment of silent vigil, then turned. But instead of going to his horse, he walked back to her stall. He leaned against the frame, just as he had in the rain. Creek didn't flood the low pasture after all, he said. That's good news, Nora said, her heart giving a small, quiet leap. They talked for 20 minutes. The Friday after that, it was 30. The conversations were a slow, careful thing, built of practicalities. He told her about mending a fence line that bordered his property, the leather of the harness that needed oiling, the way the high meadow grass was coming in thick that year. She told him about an order of rose bushes that arrived with aphids, about the difficulty of keeping lilies from wilting in the dry heat, about a new ribbon she had ordered from a catalog. They were not talking about themselves. Not really. They were talking around themselves, sketching the outlines of their lives through the details of their work. Yet, Nora learned more about him in those brief weekly conversations than she had in 4 years of silent observation. She learned he was a man who noticed things the way a hawk circled, the first buds on an aspen. She learned he carried a quiet competence, a deep-running knowledge of his land and his animals. She learned that beneath the dusty, reserved exterior, there was a steadiness that was profoundly gentle. His vigil did not change. He still bought the flowers. He still watched the train. He still looked for Clara. But the aftermath was different. The sharp edge of his disappointment seemed to be softened by the prospect of their conversation. He would walk back to her stall, the fresh bouquet in his hand, and the tension would leave his shoulders as he leaned against the doorframe and asked, "Did those rose bushes recover?" The focus of his Friday was shifting. Nora felt it, a subtle tectonic movement deep beneath the surface of their routine. At first, their talk had been an epilogue to his disappointment. Now, she began to feel that the disappointment was becoming a prologue to their talk. The bouquet in his hand became an awkward third party in their conversations. He would hold it, its bright colors a stark reminder of the woman who wasn't there, a ghost at their small feast of words. He would shift it from one hand to the other, his knuckles white. Then, one afternoon in late summer, about 3 months after the rainstorm, something changed for good. The ritual proceeded as always. The purchase, the wait, the departure of the train, the walk back to her stall. They talked for nearly an hour, the longest yet. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the platform. The station was emptying out. Jesse pushed himself off the doorframe, ready to leave. He looked down at the bouquet in his hand. The cornflowers were a startling blue in the golden light. He looked at them, then he looked at Nora, who was pretending to be busy organizing a jar of shears. He took a step forward and set the flowers on her counter. "These are for you, I expect," he said, his voice rough. Nora's hands stilled. She looked at the bouquet, then up at him. His face was unreadable, his pale eyes giving nothing away. He did not wait for her to reply. He just nodded once, a sharp, definite gesture, and walked away. She stood there, staring at the flowers. They were the same flowers he had bought for 4 years, for another woman, but they were on her counter now. He had left them for her. It was not a gift given with a flourish or a pretty speech. It was an abdication, a surrender. She picked them up. The stems were still cool and damp. She found a small glass jar, filled it with water, and placed the bouquet on the corner of her workspace where she could see it. The next Friday he did it again. He bought the flowers, waited for the train, and when it left without Clara, he walked to the stall, talked for an hour, and left the bouquet on the counter before he departed. And the next. It became the new ritual. The town, which had long since grown accustomed to the first ritual, now began to take notice of the second. Mr. Harris, the station master, would watch from his office, a slow smile spreading across his face. The men at the general store started talking. The bouquet was no longer for the train. The bouquet was for the florist. Denton began to quietly call it a courtship. Jesse seemed oblivious to the talk. He was a slow man, not in mind but in heart. It took him a long time to change direction. His life had been pointed toward Clara for so long, he did not seem to realize he had veered onto a different track. He just knew that Fridays were no longer days of dread. He knew he looked forward to the smell of damp earth and flowers that clung to Nora's stall. He knew he liked the sound of her voice, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the way she understood the world in terms of what grows and what endures. He started arriving earlier. He'd help her unload a crate of new pots or haul a bucket of water. He stopped leaning on the doorframe and started coming inside the stall, his large frame making the small space feel even smaller, but not in an unpleasant way. It felt full, protected. One Friday, nearly a year after the rainy day that had changed everything, Mr. Harris caught him as he was leaving. "You used to wait for the train, Calhoun," the old station master said, tamping tobacco into his pipe. Jesse paused. "I still do." Mr. Harris chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "No, you don't. You wait for the train to leave." The observation struck Jesse with the force of a physical blow. He stood there, speechless, as the old man lit his pipe and walked away. He thought about it all the way home. He did wait for the train to leave. He wanted it gone. He wanted the platform to clear, the noise to die down, so he could have his quiet hour of conversation with Nora. The vigil was a sham. It was just the excuse he gave himself to perform the real ritual of his week. Seeing her, he was a slow fool. The realization settled in him not with a crash, but with a quiet, profound sense of peace. The long, weary wait of waiting for Clara simply dissolved. It had not been love he was holding on to. It had been habit. It had been the memory of a promise made by a girl who no longer existed to a boy he no longer was. The man he was now, the solid, quiet man of 30, spent his Fridays with Nora Wells. The next Friday was a perfect day in late May. The sky was a high, cloudless blue. The air was warm and smelled of pine and distant rain. Jesse rode into town feeling lighter than he had in years. He didn't feel the familiar knot of dread in his stomach. He felt anticipation. He went straight to the stall. Nora was there, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, wrestling with a heavy crate of terracotta pots. "Let me," he said, moving past her to grip the crate. She looked up, surprised and pleased. "Mr. Calhoun, you're early." "Jessie," he corrected her, his voice quiet. He had never asked her to use his given name before. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. "Jessie," she repeated. She stepped back to let him move the crate. "They're for the new begonias." He bought his bouquet, their bouquet now, and handed it directly to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and this time the touch lingered for a fraction of a second. She smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face, and went to put them in their customary jar. They worked together, him shifting the heavy things, her arranging the delicate ones. They fell into an easy rhythm, punctuated by quiet talk and laughter. He was telling her about a coyote that had been trying to outsmart his dog, leaning against the counter, when the whistle of the 3:15 blew. Neither of them paid it much mind. The train was just noise now, the backdrop to their Friday. It hissed to a stop. The usual sounds of arrival filled the air. Jessie was laughing at something Nora had said, a dry comment about the coyote having more sense than some customers she knew. He felt easy. He felt happy. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Jessie?" The voice was hesitant, but familiar. It cut through the comfortable air of the flower stall like a shard of glass. Jessie's laughter died in his throat. He turned slowly. Standing on the platform just a few feet away was Clara Marsh. She was thinner, her face sharpened by city life. She wore a stylish dress of dark blue serge and a hat with a ridiculous feather that seemed entirely out of place in Denton. She carried a small, fashionable valise. A large trunk sat on the platform beside her. She had come home. Her eyes, the same lively brown he remembered, were fixed on him. They were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and a deeply ingrained expectation. She was looking at the man she had left behind, the man she had assumed would be waiting right here, on this platform, for her. And he was. He was just on the wrong side of the counter. He saw her gaze flicker from his face to Nora, who had gone utterly still beside him. He saw her take in the scene, the cozy intimacy of the small stall, the shared laughter that her arrival had interrupted, the bouquet of cornflowers and daisies sitting in a jar on the counter. In someone else's hands, silence descended. It was a thick, terrible thing, made of 5 years of waiting, 1 year of healing, and a single shattering moment of collision. "Clara," he said. The name felt foreign in his mouth. "I'm back, Jessie," she said, forcing a bright, brittle smile. "I told you I'd come back." Her smile faltered as she looked at him, really looked at him. He was not the heartbroken boy she had left. He was a man, and he was looking at her as if she were a stranger who had asked for directions. I'm sorry it took so long. Denver it was a lot. But I'm here now." She took a step forward, her hand slightly outstretched, an invitation to close the distance, to erase the years. She expected him to rush forward, to take her in his arms, to forgive everything because she had finally returned. Jessie did not move. He felt Nora shift beside him, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, as if she were preparing to fade into the background, to give him space. He felt a sudden, sharp panic at the thought of her leaving. He looked at Clara. He saw the pretty girl he had once thought he couldn't live without. He saw the ghost he had chased for 4 years. And he felt nothing. A profound and startling emptiness. The love he had nurtured for her had died so quietly he hadn't even marked its passing. It had been replaced by something else, something slow-growing and sturdy, like the lupines on the high hills. Something real. He turned his head and looked at Nora. Her face was pale, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes, her deep, steady brown eyes, were full of 1,000 unspoken questions. She was waiting too. But she was not waiting for an answer to a 4-year-old promise. She was waiting to see who he was, right now, in this moment. He made his choice. It was the easiest choice he had ever made. He turned his body fully, deliberately, away from Clara Marsh. He faced Nora. The world narrowed to the small space of the stall, to the scent of dirt and daisies, to the woman standing in front of him. "Nora," he said. His voice was low, but it carried in the sudden quiet of the platform. Clara, the station, the whole town ceased to exist. "I've been a slow fool for a long time," he began, the words coming plain and unadorned. "I spent 4 years waiting for a memory. This last year," he reached out, and his hand found hers, his calloused fingers closing around her smaller, soil-stained ones. "This last year, I've been living. I would like to keep living it. With you." He took a breath, holding her gaze. He saw the shock in her eyes, followed by a dawning, wondrous light. "I would like to stay, Nora," he said, the words as solid and true as anything he had ever built. "As your husband." Behind him, he heard a small, sharp intake of breath from Clara. He did not turn. His world was here. A slow smile spread across Nora's face, erasing the pallor and the tension. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief and a touch of wry humor. "Well," she said, her voice a little shaky but her grip on his hand firm. "You got there, Jesse." She squeezed his hand. "It took you long enough." The courtship was, in contrast to all that had preceded it, remarkably swift. Jesse Calhoun had spent 5 years in waiting and indecision. He was not inclined to waste another minute. Having made his declaration, he moved with a quiet, unshakable purpose. That first evening, he did not ride back to his ranch alone. He walked Nora home to the small cottage she rented behind the church, his hand holding hers the entire way. They walked in a comfortable silence, the unsaid things between them no longer questions, but certainties. Their evenings fell into a new rhythm. He would finish his work at the station, helping her close the stall, and they would walk to her home. He would eat supper at her small kitchen table, a meal she had cooked. The first time he felt awkward and large in the small, tidy space, but she moved around him with an easy grace that put him at ease. He learned she was as capable in a kitchen as she was with flowers. Her biscuits were light, her stew was rich. He found himself talking more in that quiet kitchen than he had in the last 10 years combined. He told her about his parents, lost to fever when he was 16. He told her about the struggle to keep the ranch going by himself, the loneliness of the long winters. She, in turn, told him about her husband, a good man and a school teacher, taken by pneumonia 2 years into their marriage. She spoke of her quiet grief and the determination that had brought her to Denton to build a new life for herself, piece by piece. They were 2 solitary people who had learned the shape of loss and the texture of resilience. They fit together like 2 sides of a well-worn coin. On Sundays, he would come to town in his clean shirt, and they would take long walks. Not along the main street, but out, toward the hills, where the town gave way to open country. He would point out the tracks of a deer, the nest of a meadowlark. She would identify the wildflowers he had never known the names for, telling him which ones had deep roots, which ones could survive a late frost. They were learning each other's language. They were married in late September, just as the aspens in the high country were turning a brilliant, shocking gold. The ceremony was in the small Denton church. It was simple and short. The whole town came. Mr. Harris, the station master, stood as Jesse's witness, looking profoundly self-satisfied. Nora wore a plain, cream-colored dress she had made herself. She wore no veil, just a circlet of cornflowers and daisies in her hair. Jesse stood beside her, solid and sure in his Sunday suit, his eyes never leaving her face. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, he did not kiss her with fiery passion, but with a gentle, profound certainty. It was a kiss that tasted of home. 6 years later, the sun was setting over the Calhoun ranch. The light, thick and golden as honey, spilled across the high meadow, igniting the tips of the tall grass. The ranch house was larger now, with a new wing Jesse had built himself. And everywhere there were flowers. They spilled from window boxes, climbed the porch railings in a riot of color, and filled a sprawling, lovingly tended garden that stretched out from the side of the house. It was Nora's domain, an outpost of impossible beauty in the rugged landscape. Jesse sat on the top step of the porch, leaning back against a post, a cup of coffee in his hand. He watched his children playing in the dusty yard. There were 2 of them. A boy of 5, named Samuel, with his father's steady blue eyes and a shock of wheat-colored hair. He was meticulously lining up stones along the edge of the garden, a look of deep concentration on his face. The other was a girl of 3, Lily, who had her mother's dark, expressive eyes and a smile that could charm a bird from a tree. She was chasing butterflies, her laughter like the chiming of a small bell. The screen door creaked open and Nora came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She sat down on the step beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She held a cup of tea. "Sam's building a wall to keep the rabbits out," she said, a smile in her voice. "He says your fences are not sufficient." Jesse grunted, a sound of deep contentment. "He's got a point. Saw one in your lettuce this morning." "Did you?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "And you didn't do anything about it?" "I'm a slow man, Nora," he said, the old joke comfortable between them. "I was thinking on the proper course of action." She laughed, a warm, easy sound. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the children, watching the light fade from the sky. This was the rhythm of their life now, a quiet cadence of work and love, of shared burdens and simple joys. He remembered the hundreds of Fridays he had spent on that station platform, a man hollowed out by waiting. He had thought that loyalty was his defining feature. He had been wrong. Loyalty was just the shape his loneliness had taken. Love, he had learned, was not about waiting for someone to come back. It was about building a place someone would want to come home to. Lily, having abandoned her butterflies, ran to the porch and clambered into Nora's lap. She had a fistful of crushed wildflowers. "For you, Mama," she said, pressing the bruised petals into her mother's hand. Nora smoothed the little girl's hair. "Thank you, sweet pea. They're beautiful." Jesse watched them, his heart full to bursting. He looked at his wife, her face softened by the twilight, her eyes full of the same steady light that had first drawn him in. He looked at the home they had built, the children they were raising, the life that had grown in the space where a long and useless vigil had once stood. "You know," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "I almost rode home that day. The day it rained so hard." Nora turned her head, her cheek still resting on his shoulder. "I know. I'm glad I didn't," he said. She reached over and placed her free hand on his, her fingers lacing through his. "Me too, Jesse," she whispered. "Me too." They sat there together as the first stars pricked the deep purple of the sky, 2 people rooted in a life that had grown not from a lightning strike of passion, but from the slow, patient tending of a small, stubborn seed of hope. It had been planted in the unlikely soil of a train station platform and watered with quiet conversation until it had finally, in its own slow time, bloomed. That's the thing about love. Sometimes it is not a grand arrival on a westbound train. It is not a promise shouted against the wind. Sometimes it is much quieter. It is the steady, daily act of showing up. It is leaving a bouquet on a counter, not for a ghost, but for the person who sees you. It is the bravery in a simple question and the courage to finally answer it. It is the realization that the place you were waiting for was beside you all along.